Welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today is, well, it's an ambitious one. We are going to completely rewire how you think about history.
Yeah, it's a huge shift.
It really is.
Hmm.
Because for a very long time, the standard approach to the past has been to look at it as this rigid, linear timeline.
Right.
We're taught to see history as a sequence of isolated empires rising and falling. We're conditioned to look for the isolated genius having a sudden moment of inspiration.
Or the solo great leader.
Exactly. The great leader who supposedly drives all of human progress entirely by themselves. But today, we're throwing that old model out the window.
We really are.
We're exploring history through a much more dynamic, interconnected lens. We're talking about network theory and how it fundamentally alters our understanding of human progress.
And it is hard to overstate just how seismic this shift is for anyone interested in historiography.
Yeah.
Network theory has completely revolutionized the academic field over the last, say, 25 to 30 years because it changes the baseline epistemological question.
Okay, break that down for us.
Sure. So traditionally, classical political history operates on a very straightforward, almost top-down premise. It asks questions like, what did this state do? Or, what specific policy did this emperor enact?
Right.
Network theory steps back and completely changes that foundational inquiry.
It flips the script. We stop looking at the individual in a vacuum.
We do. Instead of focusing on the isolated actions of a state or a leader, the approach asks who was connected to whom, and more importantly, how did these connections shape the circulation of knowledge, the flow of power, or the distribution of resources?
So we're moving away from studying individual actors as if they existed on an empty stage.
Exactly. Instead, we are mapping the dynamic, living web of relationships that actually allowed them to function.
Okay, let's unpack this vocabulary a bit. Because if we are going to talk about webs and networks, we need to establish the ground rules.
Right.
But let's skip the dry textbook definitions and get right into the practical application. We're obviously looking at nodes and edges.
Yes, the basic building blocks. In this framework, the nodes are the fundamental points within a network.
Like the dots on a map.
Exactly. But what makes this approach so versatile is that a node isn't just a person. I mean, yes, it can be an individual.
Like a translator working late into the night.
Or a merchant traveling across borders, or a prominent scholar. But nodes can also be physical institutions.
Okay.
A bustling madrasa functions as a node. A royal palace is a node. A remote mountain monastery is a node.
So it's any point where activity or information gathers.
Right. And if you zoom out even further on the map, entire cities function as massive gravitational nodes in these historical networks.
And then the edges, or the ties, are the connective tissue linking those nodes together.
Yes. An edge is the actual relationship.
So that could be a formal teacher-student dynamic?
It could. Or an active trade route across the desert. A system of financial patronage, even the physical movement of a manuscript from one library to another.
And the totality of those actors and relations, that is the network itself.
Exactly. And you really cannot discuss this paradigm shift without bringing in Bruno Latour.
Oh, right. Actor-network theory.
Yes. Latour pointed out something that fundamentally disrupted academic research. He argued that knowledge production is never the result of individual, isolated genius.
Never.
Well, his point is that knowledge is the direct product of the relationships between different actors. It is the network itself that produces the knowledge.
Okay, but I get the appeal of zooming out to look at the network, but doesn't this risk completely erasing the individual genius?
How so?
Well, surely we can't pretend that an extraordinary mind like Al-Kindi, a brilliant philosopher, was just a product of his zip code and his friend group.
Yeah.
If I'm understanding Latour, it sounds a bit deterministic.
That is a very common and very valid critique to raise. But it isn't that Latour or network theory erases the brilliance of the individual.
Okay.
Al-Kindi was undeniably a genius, but what this theory argues is that Al-Kindi's genius could not manifest or be preserved without the network.
Oh, I see. So it's a bit like baking bread.
Okay, I like where this is going.
You can't credit just the flour for the bread. The bread only exists because of the interaction between the flour, the yeast, the baker, and the heat of the oven.
That's a fantastic analogy.
The network is what bakes the bread.
Exactly. The flour might be of the highest quality, and that's your individual genius, but without the yeast, the baker, and the oven, it remains just a pile of dust. The network activates the potential.
I love that.
And that brings us to the first major paradigm shift this theory introduces to historical analysis. It moves us away from the great men theory of history and toward interconnected relationships.
The contrast there is pretty stark. The classic approach to history usually zeroes in on top-down leadership.
Right.
It treats history as a highlight reel of solo accomplishments. The caliph conquered this region, or the emperor built this library.
But the network approach demands a completely different investigation.
It demands we ask who is whispering in the caliph's ear.
Yes. Who are those advisors connected to? How did intelligence actually flow through this specific web of scholars, military generals, and regional governors?
So history transforms from being a static list of things a leader decreed into a living, breathing social process.
Exactly, because a decree from a throne means absolutely nothing if the edges of the network don't carry that command to the provinces.
Right, but mapping out who knows who only gets us so far. What I find truly fascinating is seeing what actually happens when you put a physical object, like a rare scientific manuscript, into that web.
The physical flow of information.
Yes. Let's trace one of those journeys, because network theory is incredibly powerful when it comes to understanding how information actually transfers from one place to another.
Let's do it. Let's look at how a medical text spreads throughout the medieval world.
Go.
If you rely on the classical historical record, the narrative might simply say, the caliph ordered a Greek medical text to be translated into Arabic.
And that's usually where the story abruptly ends.
Right. The knowledge just seemingly appears by royal decree, as if the caliph waved a magic wand and the book materialized in the royal library.
Which we know is logistically impossible.
Right. But when we use the network approach, we zoom in on the actual edges and nodes. We see the real, grueling pathways.
We see the actual journey, which is often fraught with friction.
A lot of friction. Under the network approach, we might trace a Syriac doctor working in a small, dusty clinic. He interacts with a bilingual merchant who brings a crumbling Greek manuscript from the Byzantine frontier.
So that's edge number one.
Exactly. That text then travels to a specific translator in the city of Harran.
And Harran isn't just a random stop. The translator there has to wrestle with the linguistic nuances. They're trying to find the Syriac or Arabic equivalent for highly specific Greek anatomical terms.
Terms that perhaps haven't even been coined yet in those target languages.
Exactly the kind of friction I mean. It takes months, maybe years of work.
Right. Then, that translator in Harran teaches a student who eventually relocates to Baghdad.
Another edge.
And that student in Baghdad secures the funding, another vital edge in the network, to purchase expensive parchment and ink to create a physical copy of the synthesized text.
Wow.
And it doesn't stop there. Decades later, a traveling scholar copies that version, and eventually, that specific iteration of the text travels all the way to Cairo along a heavily guarded trade route.
When you lay it out like that, it makes the history of science feel like a multi-generational relay race.
It really is.
Knowledge doesn't just magically appear because a ruler asked for it. It travels along very specific, traceable, and highly vulnerable pathways.
Extremely vulnerable.
Right. If the merchant's caravan is raided, or if the student in Baghdad runs out of patronage money, the knowledge stops dead in its tracks.
The network is fragile. And recognizing that fragility leads us to another major analytical shift.
Which is?
Dismantling the concept of the center. Traditional history loves a single central protagonist. We are constantly fed narratives about the center of Rome or the center of Baghdad.
Or the center of Istanbul.
Yeah.
It's a very monocentric way of viewing the world.
Exactly, monocentric.
The idea that everything important supposedly happens in the capital and the rest of the empire is just waiting around for instructions.
And network theory systematically shatters that monocentric myth. It replaces the idea of a single dominant center with a polycentric view of the world.
Polycentric meaning many centers interacting simultaneously.
Right. If we look at the early Islamic scientific golden age, there was no single center of knowledge. It wasn't just happening in one palace in Baghdad.
We're looking at a landscape with multiple massive hubs. You have Baghdad, sure, but you also have Harran, Gundeshapur, Damascus, and Merv.
And let's look closely at those hubs, because each brought something entirely unique to the network. Take Gundeshapur, for example.
Okay.
Long before Baghdad was even a blueprint, Gundeshapur was an intellectual powerhouse in the Sassanid Empire.
Right.
It was a refuge for Nestorian Christians fleeing persecution.
Yeah.
And they brought all this Greek and Syriac medical knowledge with them. It became the premier medical center of the ancient world.
And then you have a city like Merv, situated right on the arteries of the Silk Road. It's an oasis of scholars gathering knowledge from India, Persia, and beyond.
Exactly. In a polycentric network, all of these cities are vital nodes. They are all equally critical parts of a vast, interconnected web.
So you simply cannot understand the scientific output of that era by only looking at Baghdad.
You can't. The brilliance of Baghdad wasn't that it generated all knowledge internally. Its brilliance was its connectivity.
It positioned itself as the ultimate routing hub.
Yes, a routing hub for the edges connecting Gundeshapur's medicine, Merv's astronomy, and Harran's philosophy. Because isolation breeds stagnation, while networks breed innovation.
That is perfectly said. And this brings us to the absolute ideal case study for applying this approach. It's highly relevant to anyone studying the circulation of ideas.
Oh, absolutely.
We need to talk about what has traditionally been called the early Islamic translation movement.
It is the perfect crucible for testing network theory. Because between the translators, the wealthy patrons, the distinct polycentric cities, and the physical texts themselves, you have an incredibly dense, intense circulation of knowledge.
Yeah.
In fact, it's so complex that modern researchers are actively changing the vocabulary they use to describe it.
Right. There's a major shift in academic circles right now.
Yeah.
Historians are increasingly abandoning the term translation movement altogether.
Yes, they are.
They're opting instead for the term knowledge networks, which feels like a profound correction.
It is a necessary correction, because the word movement implies a monocentric, top-down, singular force.
Right. It sounds like a government initiative that starts on a Monday and ends 5 years later.
Exactly. But calling it knowledge networks acknowledges the messy, decentralized reality on the ground. The translation process was a highly complex, multi-actor social process that took place organically.
Across massive geographical webs spanning centuries.
Oh.
And by reframing it as a knowledge network, we fundamentally change who gets to be a part of the history books.
We do.
Classic history usually focuses almost exclusively on the highly visible figures. We hear all about the powerful caliphs who funded the libraries.
Or the famous elite philosophers whose names are on the covers of the translated texts.
Right. But network theory brings the invisible actors out of the shadows.
This is my favorite part of the theory. When you actually map the network, you suddenly see the critical historical importance of everyday people. You see the scribes. You see the students making annotations in the margins. You see the copyists, the traveling merchants, the paper makers, and the local doctors.
They were basically the 9th century equivalent of the IT department.
That's hilarious, but true.
Completely ignored by the executives until the server goes down, but actually the ones keeping the entire empire running.
Right. In the classic historical model, these people are treated as background extras. But in the network model, they are the essential infrastructure.
Because without the meticulous copyist or the merchant willing to risk his life carrying a saddlebag of manuscripts across the desert, the text never leaves the city.
And the knowledge simply dies. This theory gives agency back to the people who actually did the ground-level work of history.
It really does. And it also highlights something beautiful about cross-cultural synthesis. Because of this vast web of invisible actors, you had completely distinct knowledge traditions physically and intellectually crashing into each other.
The merging is perhaps the most significant outcome of this network. You had Greek philosophical frameworks, Syriac linguistic traditions, Persian statecraft,
And Indian mathematical concepts.
yes, all flowing into the exact same interconnected web. They didn't just sit next to each other on a shelf, they combined.
So an astronomer in Damascus is using Indian numerals to calculate the orbit of planets based on Greek Ptolemaic models, which were translated by a Syriac Christian.
Exactly. It proves that knowledge in this era was a collective cross-cultural product. It wasn't isolated to one ethnicity, one religion, or one city. It was deeply, inherently collaborative.
Which is why this framework is causing such a stir in modern historiography. It forces us to align our research with different academic currents.
It does. If you look at where network theory fits into the broader academic landscape, it is highly compatible with what we call the history of knowledge.
Which makes perfect sense given everything we've discussed about how ideas travel and mutate along those edges.
Right. And it also aligns perfectly with the new social history.
Just for those unfamiliar, new social history is essentially history told from the bottom up.
Yes. Instead of just studying the kings and generals, it focuses on the social reality of human interactions, the merchants, the artisans, the everyday dynamics of society.
And network theory gives us the mathematical and conceptual tools to map those everyday interactions.
Exactly.
I've also seen it discussed in relation to the cultural turn in history, meaning the shift toward understanding how people made sense of their world through language, symbols, and culture, rather than just looking at hard economics or politics.
It is partially compatible with the cultural turn, yes, because networks carry culture. Right. But where network theory really creates friction is with the old guard of classic political history. It completely rejects the traditional idea that state policies or the whims of individual rulers are the sole engines of historical change.
The state is just one node among many.
Exactly.
So as we synthesize all of this for you, our listener, we have to ask the ultimate so what question.
Always a good question.
Why does this specific academic theory matter for your understanding of the world today? Well, it matters because network theory proves, at a structural level, that intellectual life is highly collaborative.
Knowledge does not happen in a vacuum.
Right. It teaches us that to truly understand how the world changes, we must look at the connections between people, not just the individuals themselves. We have to look at the edges, not just the most prominent nodes.
It fundamentally changes how we assign value to historical actions. I mean, if you believe in the great man theory, you wait around for a genius to save the world. But if you understand network theory, you realize that the world is saved and knowledge is advanced by the strength and resilience of the connections we build.
Which is a remarkably empowering way to look at our own roles in society. We aren't all going to be the caliph or the legendary philosopher, but we are all vital edges and nodes in the networks we participate in.
And that raises a fascinating question for you to mull over. We've spent this time looking backward. We've mapped the early Islamic knowledge networks, tracing the arduous physical routes of scribes, copyists, and traveling merchants across the medieval landscape. But history isn't just something that happened 1,000 years ago.
No, we are in the middle of a historical process right now.
Precisely. If history is best understood not through the actions of solitary leaders, but through these invisible webs of everyday actors, what will future historians see when they map the vast digital knowledge networks that you are participating in at this very moment?
Oh, wow.
When researchers a century from now look back at our era of instant global communication, who will they identify as the invisible actors in our modern flow of information? Who are the scribes and copyists of the digital age keeping our network alive?
That is a brilliant thought to leave on. History is a network we are all actively maintaining. Thank you for joining this deep dive. Keep questioning the connections around you and never stop looking for those invisible actors.